Thank you. So if you don't want your image shown, feel free to turn off your camera, but we are recording now, so thank you. And with that, I'm gonna pass off to Josie to do a quick recap of updates and accomplishments to date. So thank you, Josie.
Yeah, thanks. And when we were thinking about, it's been a year. Usually we do an update on the last meeting, but that didn't feel as pertinent these days. But I just want to talk through what this group has done. This isn't all stuff EPA has done. Lily's on as a representative of that, but I think work that this group has been involved in that has been felt meaningful and that we are aware of. It's certainly not a comprehensive list, but this is kind of what we're aware of. There was a beach cleanup in the spring of 2021 that removed a lot of concrete rubble from the beach, which was a big improvement. I need to move this off my screen. We did the beach sampling in the fall of 2021, and that was targeted with input from all of you. You really helped us understand what the need was to understand on the beach and where the limits of that sampling should be, and also how we should look at that park being used in the future. There was the idea of doing the day in the life of a Portland Harbor sediment core. So that happened. We overcame the issues with drone footage and figured that out. We did the public availability session during the sampling in fall of 2021. And then all the work that went into the infographic that Laura kindly went and posted down at the park recently, I believe. That was also a long process that we persevered on, and we now have an accurate infographic to share with park users about what's happening on the beach and in the sediments there. Yeah, and then ultimately it has culminated with the actual sampling itself. And so that's where we are now. We're kind of ready to share out the results of that sampling and talk about how it will inform the next round of work at the project area. And so today, I'm going to go in and I'm going to show you a series of figures that have the results on there. Ask questions. We can, we'll see how this goes. We can always follow up with more information later. And yeah, I think we can just dive right in. So my hope is that at the end of this, you'll understand what we've learned so far about the riverbank and sediment conditions at Cathedral Park. And as I mentioned, it goes all the way through the Green Anchors property and in front of the BES lab. That whole strip is what we'll be talking about. And figure out if there's places where additional clarification will be helpful in the future. Right, so I'm going to take over and share my screen here. Yeah, I'm going to start with,
I was just going to say, I'm going to put the link to that infographic for Morgan State in the chat, just to refresh everyone's memory on it too. So
it's already in there too, Laura. Multiple places.
Great. All right, so digging into the sample results. So remember we did the incremental sampling on the beach, and this is data that we got back in late 2021. And so we had a few meetings in early 2022 where we went through this data in particular in depth because it was of great interest to everyone. Just as a refresh on what the results of that were. And so this was a sampling effort where we took the top 6 inches of soil in at least 50 places in each one of these boxes and combined it all together. It's called incremental sampling, and it allows us to get a really good understanding of an average over an area, which is what's appropriate to look at when we're thinking about human contact, right? If for long-term exposure, if you go to the park day in, day out, what are you exposed to is kind of the average of what's there rather than what's at an individual point. And so what we found there is that the numbers for arsenic and carcinogenic polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which is a certain fraction of oils, basically, that those are both continue to be slightly above what we'd like to see for our long-term concentrations out there. And then dioxins and PCBs are below our threshold of concern in the long term. And I think Alyssa's going to put in the chat some of the footage from the meetings we had where we went into depth about those results. But I'm happy if anyone has any questions now. I'm happy to field a few. Okay. If they come up later, feel free to ask. Okay, I'm gonna leave this up for a long time. You can let your eyes get used to it. I'm gonna kind of walk you through what you're looking at. One thing to realize.
We have a question from
Oh, yeah.
Laura. Hey, Laura.
Hi, I just wondered, what were the dioxin levels? You said they weren't at threshold or above it or whatever.
Yeah. So the number for total dioxins that would have been a level above our long-term cleanup level would have been 0.01.
Okay.
So this, yeah, so does that make sense? So this is 0.002, and if it had been 0.01 or above, that's
Okay.
where it would have gone above our long-term threshold. Good question.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so this part of the project area you're looking at is just downstream of Cathedral Park itself. This is the Green Anchors property here. This is the Love Boat. Can you guys see my little hand? Yes. This is that big dock that comes out. And then over here is the Markham North property that the port owns and has done an uplands cleanup on. So does that make sense to everybody of where you are? And if you went just off the screen to the right, you'd be at the Cathedral Park boat ramp. And then when we look at this figure, the red and white circles and pentagons are where we did the sampling in 2021. And so these were the sediment cores out here and the riverbank cores. And then they're color coded either red or white. And the red means that somewhere in that sediment core, we found concentrations that were above our active cleanup threshold. So there's a level on this site of contamination that if any one of our contaminants is above our remedial action level, then we're intend to take active measures there, either dredging or capping. So areas where there's a red dot, it means that in that core, we had some kind of exceedance of that threshold. And then the table that's associated with that dot tells you what the exceedance was. So for example, this sediment core, this is SC08. And if we look at the table that's associated with that, you can see that the exceedance was for DDX, which is a pesticide. And you can see the depth at which we found the exceedances. So in the 0 to 1 foot, there was a exceedance, and in the 1 to 2 feet. Now the yellow means it's above our action level, and the orange just means it's a higher concentration than that. And anything that's not shaded means it's below our action levels. I'll let that settle for a second. Where we have a sample point where the icon is white, that means that there were no exceedances anywhere in that sample core. And then as you look at the different sample points, you can see that it's different contaminants in different cores. So for example, surface core 10 had DDX at 4 to 5 feet. It had PCBs shallower in the 2 to 4 foot range that are above our action level. And it also had PECDD at 3 to 4 feet. So when I look at this, I think, okay, this means in this area, there's sediment in the 2 to 5 foot depth range that we need to do active cleanup on. And as we go along, we can see that that's, you know, there appears to be contamination kind of in that lens, in the 1 to 5 foot lens through this area. The good news is in most places we got to the bottom of it. We know that it's not deeper. And so that helps us think about like, oh, is this something we could dredge out and be done with or not, right? When we see really deep contamination, we know it's going to be harder to dredge it out completely. And so that's when we start to think about capping. But in a place like this, it's looking like we might be able to remove it all, which is always the goal. Any questions coming up for folks?
Would anyone like and if anyone wants like a recap of what the colors mean? Could you say one more time, Josie, what the orange and the yellow mean?
Yeah, so the yellow means it's above our remedial action level, which is the level at which we're going to do some kind of active remedy, either capping or dredging. And then orange is a higher threshold than that. It means it's a higher level of contamination. So for example, PCBs, once it hits 75 is our action level, and that is going to turn that color yellow. And then if it exceeds 200 is where we turn it to orange.
Laura?
Yeah, I'm wondering who the responsible party is here.
This is an area we're doing design. EPA is leading the remedial design in this particular project area.
For cleanup,
That's right.
though. For cleanup.
Oh, it'll be rolled into the larger, the actual cleanup will be done under a consent decree that will be negotiated with a number of parties. And they will implement this remedy. They'll be the ones that do the active cleanup.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's a good thing to just highlight, because when we started this working group, we weren't sure what was going to happen. We initially were going to do the initial sampling. EPA was going to do the initial sampling to inform the design, but now, like Josie said, we have committed to doing the full remedial design for this area, not the remedial action, the cleanup, but the full remedial design.
But can you say which parties EPA will be charging?
No, the consent decree will be negotiated not by project area, but for the whole site. And so it's going to become less important, the individual, like the geographic location of that each performing party is responsible for. They're doing their own allocation process that's outside of EPA, where they're deciding amongst themselves who's responsible for what percentage of the costs. So if you
I have a question about that.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, sorry, I'm on a cell phone, so.
No, we can hear you well.
Is there a deadline for that decision?
No, there's a pretty prescribed enforcement process that happens under the CERCLA law. And so we'll go through that process. There's a step where EPA will send out what's called special notice letters that will officially start the negotiations for that consent decree. And we haven't done that yet. All right, a couple other takeaways from this part of the data results. So, what does this mean for our next round? And one thing that's important for remedial design is to understand where the edges of the contamination are, right? And to feel confident that we've fully delineated where the sediment is that we need to actively remediate. And so in some places we did do this. So see, like SC15, SC17, they're at the edge of where we think the contamination is. They came back clean. So this is a good edge for us. But over here, we didn't hit the edge of it yet. And so in our follow-up sampling, we'll step out into this area out towards the navigation channel and look for the edge of it. And same with this area in here. We're going to need to step in towards the bank at Marcom and take additional samples to fully delineate where the edge of that contamination is. All right, I'm about to move on to the next, to march us up the river. Any other questions on this one at this point?
When do you reach 30% design?
So we're gonna, the next few steps, one is to do something called a basis of design report, which is where we look at kind of what are the engineering constraints in our project area. what do we know about the contamination, what's going to drive the design. So there's going to be that milestone. We're going to do another round of sampling, what's called a supplemental sampling effort. And after that, we'll be ready to start drafting the 30% design. Which is probably, you know, for time wise, we're probably 1.5 to 2 years out from that. All right, moving up the river. So this is the Cathedral Park boat ramp. This is the St. John's Bridge. This is the fishing pier. And now this is also along the beach is the same locations that we did the incremental sampling in the top 6 inches. We also took cores in that area. And so these are different because they are a single point rather than an average over the whole area. For the most part, those riverbank cores came back below our action levels. There are a couple that are above. One is in RB 15. For those of you who go there all the time, you know, there's that area where it's like a broken concrete foundation, an old foundation that pokes out a little bit into the beach area, which is right here. And so this sample was taken right off the edge of that, which is probably an old building or footing of some kind. And so we'll go back as part of our supplemental sampling and take more samples around here and figure out what's going on. And then this one was also above our action levels for DDX, pH, and PCBs. And so we'll do the same thing. We'll do additional sampling around this area to further delineate those 2 spots. And then if you guys remember from last year, there's the water, or 2 years ago, the water levels were such that it was pretty challenging to get into this area with our equipment. This is a place where we don't have much subsurface data. We do have old surface data that is below our action levels, but this is another area that we're definitely going to go back into and get more data so that we really understand that depth of contamination. But again, I'm cautiously optimistic that this, for the most part, the contamination seems to be in the shallower areas over here. And we have some good bounding samples. So between SC21 here, this white sample, and SC24, these were both 15-foot cores that went down and didn't encounter any contamination above our action levels. And so we've successfully bounded the SMA in this area, but again, not over here. So you'll see some more step out samples in parts of this area.
What's an SMA?
Oh, thank you. It's a sediment management area. It's those areas in which we're going to do an active cleanup action. Over here, this is right off the fishing pier, and you can see this is a place where it's the one place where we did not find the depth of contamination, and it goes down quite deep. So this is another area we're going to come out and do additional sampling with what's called a sonic coring rig. So all of this sediment the cores were collected with a vibrocore, and where you take that steel pipe and vibrate it down into the ground. And it works really well with most sediments, but it doesn't work well with heavily compacted or sediments that have a lot of crud in it. And this area had a lot of wood chips. And so we had trouble collecting, like this sample, I think we only were able to get down 3 feet. We weren't able to get in here, but we do see that this is an area of contamination. And so we're going to go in with something called a sonic drilling rig, which is just a more powerful way to get a sample. And we're confident we'll be able to get the data that we need as part of that effort. Any questions on this one?
Any questions are good. Don't feel like your question might not be important because it is, but you can also just kind of absorb it.
And these will be available. So these are the figures that are going to come out in the final report. And that final report, we just gave them the thumbs up to produce the final report yesterday based on a revised draft. So we'll get that published, the fully tagged 508 compliant report. and then get it through EPA's approval process to post. And so you guys will have these figures to pour at over your leisure within the next few weeks.
Yeah, go for it, Kismira.
On the last area, you mentioned that you had gone deep enough on the areas where you found contamination on these contaminated pieces. Is that the same?
For the most part. So the rules that we've applied to every project area, including ourselves, are that in order to define the depth of contamination, you need two intervals, two 1-foot intervals next to each other that are both below our action levels. And so SC 25 has that, right? It's got these guys down here that are contiguous and below our action levels. SC 27 has that. SC 23 does not. It only has one interval below our action levels. And so as part of our supplemental, we'll go back and get more depth data there just to be confident that we've really hit the bottom of that contamination. And likewise, SC 33, we don't have that, right? In our very bottom interval, we still have contamination above our action levels.
So
That makes sense.
it does. But how do you decide how deep to go? Because if you have the capacity and the testing to go deeper and you didn't, how did you decide not to do that?
It's partly based on, so there was a lot of data collected during the remedial investigation that we look at. It's oftentimes they were using larger intervals. They were using like 2 to 5 foot intervals for their samples rather than 1 foot intervals. But it gives us an idea about how deep the contamination was in different areas at the time. So that's one thing we use to decide how deep of a sample to take.
Can you just pause really fast on the Josie? And so when you say remedial investigation, when did that occur?
That happened in,
Oh, guys, go ahead and answer that, Josie, and then Cassie, you can jump in.
that happened in the early 2000s. So after the site was listed, that remedial investigation began. It took about 15 years, but a lot of the data that was collected in like 2005 to 2007 is when they did a big sediment sampling effort.
And that's part of the super fun process to help us understand, how we want to do the proposed plan for the whole site for cleanup. And so that occurred a while ago. Cassie, did you want to jump in? No.
Oh, no.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so Josie, part 2 of you said the remedial investigation was like the first, that data from that was helping us.
The data from that helps. It gives us a starting point. And then we just kind of, the other limitation, the VibraCore technology itself can really only consistently get you 15 feet deep. And so like there are some parts of the site where, not the Cathedral Park project area, but other parts of the Superfund site where they do that as a first go. And then when they see that they haven't hit the bottom of the contamination, then they change technology like we're going to do and go back out with a different technology to go as deep as they need to hit the bottom of the contamination. I think a sonic rig can get you about 30 feet down.
Does that answer your question, Kesmir, or did you want to ask some follow-up pieces?
No, that answers it. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, moving further upstream, up in front of the BES lab. Oh, sorry, a little backpedal. This one just shows the results of those Riverbank cores that turned red. And another thing to think about here, our action levels are based on the whole site. These are not a human exposure action level. These are often triggered by a fish consumption concern. So we see like the PCBs that are 2 to 3 feet down right off that foundation that we were talking about came back at 217 parts per billion. And the human health level of concern for PCBs is 370. So it's still not a human health, even if folks were exposed to that buried sediment, it's not a human health concern. It's a bit of a complicating nuance in all of this. All right, now moving in front of the BES lab. So same color coding applies. The red dots are where we put cores in and got results that were above our action level at some interval within that core. The white ones are cores where we didn't find any exceedances of our action levels in the core. And, kind of similar results we're seeing in general. There's sporadic DDX in the sediments. There's pretty consistent PCBs and dioxins. And there's occasional exceedances for PAHs, and those are the polyaromatic hydrocarbons. And this is another place. So last summer it was really hard to get access to this beach because of the walkway that goes out to the fishing pier. And then there's a bunch of debris on the beach, and there's a big pile field. They're like cut off maybe a foot above the mud line in this area. So it was difficult to get equipment in there. So for a first go, we decided to do just a handheld drill that can get you down about 3 feet. And that's why the sample results along the beach there only go down 3 feet. But we'll be going down, we'll be bringing in equipment this summer that will allow us to drill down deeper and get to that depth of contamination along the beach. We'll also be, this is an area where we're going to need to further explore to make sure that we get to the edges of the contamination. Out here, we're also going to be taking some more samples. So this are what we're doing right now is kind of combing through these results and thinking about what other questions do we have now that we know this.
Laura.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the info here, and it looks like there are exceedances along this beach that you were just mentioning. You're going to come back and do some more sampling. A very basic question on this map, it looks very contained. It's all in a little red dot, but I wonder in reality, and maybe I should know this, but what is the radius of a little red dot on that beach, for example, which people do use, and increasingly so? I wonder how much are you going to remediate or?
So when we look at this data, what this tells me is that there's a lens of contamination at least down to 2 feet and deeper in this area where it all needs to be addressed. And so we assume, in the absence of other information in between these two samples, we assume that it's just a gradient between those two sample points.
Okay.
So this will lead to this whole area being actively cleaned up.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question.
Great question. Awesome questions from everyone. Any other questions for Josie right now? I know you're going to keep going, Josie, but.
No, I think this is the extent of my prepared figures to show.
We can go back to other figures too, that Josie showed as well. Hey, Willie.
Hey there. So one question I had to do, it sounds like generally if the contamination is a depth of maybe even I don't know if there's a cutoff of 1 to 3 feet, 1 to 4 feet, that it generally makes sense to scoop dirt out and replace it, or on a shoreline, maybe scooping out a beach area and replacing it with sand. But it seems like for some of these areas on the beach, there's piling fields. So if the typical prescription for a low depth contamination would prescribe scooping out stuff, would that also mean that piles would be taken out at the same time? Would that be part of a prescription?
Yes. Yep.
And is there a general rule of thumb for where 1 to 4 feet, 1 to 5 feet, like where's the cutoff where it just capping starts looking like a better alternative than dirt removal?
I think there's more to it than that. So it's not, the other constraints matter, like, because you have to be able to then, if you want to cap it, you have to, engineering wise, you have to be able to place a cap, which is really hard on some of these banks. And you have to think about where you are in relation to the navigation channel. So one of the big design challenges we have is that we need to ensure that whatever remedy we leave in place doesn't impact the Army Corps' ability to do a full navigation dredge in the future.
Interesting.
Yeah,
So if it's in the channel, it's going to get removed because they want to preserve the ability to dredge. They're not going to put a cap in the channel.
correct. The remedy calls for in the channel full dredging to the feasible depth of dredging. There are some parts of the channel that have some real dense contamination in that they might struggle to be able to even get a dredge down deep enough, and those might need to be capped. But so I think the other engineering constraints come into play more than a general rule of thumb does, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I can't recall who I talked to about this recently, but it sounds like there's some debate now where it was initially considered that capping was a more affordable way to go. But when considering the long-term maintenance of the cap, it's starting to look a little more like removal is preferred in a lot of situations.
Right. I think that's very true. And it's important when folks do that design, part of the requirement is that they provide that monitoring and maintenance plan. You know, and I think the reality of a cap is that you're signing yourself up to maintain that cap forever until you actually take the step to remove the contamination. And that has a real cost associated with it.
Interesting. And one last thing, like in terms of removal versus capping in beach recreational areas like the ring around Cathedral Park shoreline, would you anticipate that's something that the community is going to have to fight for removal of contaminated material because there might be a propensity to cap rather than remove? Or is it, I mean, when you're looking at those types of areas, I mean, not that we're not going to have to keep an eye on it no matter what, but I mean, just generally accepted practices, does any gut as to what the treatment might be on the shoreline?
We're too early to tell. I think the nice thing about EPA being the designer on this is that we get to fully consider all the options. And we're not, I'm optimistic that we will be able to remove this stuff. I think it just makes sense. You know, to the extent we don't want to leave a legacy problem behind that we don't have to leave behind.
Yeah, and the needs of the community to have a recreational space and
Totally.
Yep.
But I do think based on this sampling, you know, this line is from our old data, and I anticipate our area of active cleanup is going to pull back to this area, because we're just not seeing concentrations above our action level in this area anymore.
got it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And Cassie had to jump off, Josie, but since we're recording this, she had a question just about how EPA is thinking about integrating habitat into remedy options for
That's
this
a great
area.
question.
Mhm.
We think about it all the time. The way that the law works, it separates out the idea of resource damages and assessment and restoration of those resources from the chemical cleanup, the cleanup of the contaminated material. And EPA's work is really in this realm of cleaning up the contaminated material. But to the extent that our cleanup has negative impacts on the environment, those impacts need to be mitigated for. And so what that means in reality is that, you know, our cleanup is going to have, the cleanup itself will have an impact. And so we do expect to see some habitat mitigation work that needs to happen out of our work. But until we understand what our action is going to be, we don't know what the mitigation requirements will be. there are some areas of the harbor, but you know, the hope, everybody knows the goal is to really, for salmon, is to create off-channel habitat within the Superfund site itself, so that these fish can like have stepping stones to get through the industrial area. So there's some really exciting ideas out there of places we could create some of that off-channel habitat, or ways that we can do bank work that is creates a better habitat, just a, you know, a more beneficial habitat space, like not riprapping all the banks, for example. But it's going to be a balance between making sure that we really create a remedy that contains the contamination and also helps fish in the long run.
That is with this working group, right, Josie? That's one of the cool things too about EPA having this working group and leading the design is we'll be able to keep everyone in the loop on our thinking on all of that, right? With this
Sure.
working group. So keep you all in the communication on all of that. There are other questions folks have on Laura?
Yes, so I'm all jazzed from Laura Shera's recent presentation about including habitat into this cleanup process. And I totally get what Josie just said about it happening kind of incrementally and slowly and collaboratively. I'm just wondering, just so that it doesn't get lost, and that's what Laura Shera was from the Yakima Nation was really stressing, just so it doesn't get lost. I wonder if there might not be one spot, Josie, that we could focus on, or one habitat restoration spot that we could focus on in the Cathedral Park area that we could begin, because she really you know, cautioned that it's better to do it before than after the cleanup, because you know, who knows. So I'm just wondering, is there a spot that we could be looking at now?
You know, I think for this project area in particular, you know, we're going to need to come in and clean up this whole area. So kind of starting a habitat project there now is putting the cart before the horse.
Okay.
And the same thing over in this area, as we march down the beach. Ugh, sorry if I'm making you nauseous here. Hang on. So I think for what we can do, there's not something to start on right now.
Well, as I think of it, I guess at Green Acres, you know, Tim with his bees, it's already sort of it is going on at Green Acres in different ways. It would just be interesting to have something closer to the park or in the park. Just something to think about. I know that's not quite your bailiwick, but something to consider.
Is Matt on still?
He is.
I don't know if you want.
Yes, Matt, you are on still, and Kazmira has a question too, I see. But yeah, Matt, have you thought about any of kind of what Laura Philbin's talking about? Or and if not, that's totally cool. This is a space to, like, you know, talk about ideas and stuff, even if EPA can't, you know, do them right now.
Can you hear me there?
Yeah.
All right, I heard my name in between shoveling of ice on the sidewalk here. Yeah, we definitely would like to have a habitat piece to our project. It's as you might know, there's a lot of steps in between now and getting there and getting something in the ground, but you know, it's something we're actively looking at, but can't really make any promises until all the powers that be sign off on things. So
Awesome. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah.
Thanks, Laura, for bringing that up. I hear what you're saying. Like, it's nice to have something tangible to kind of like think about or like work on. So, Kazmira, did you have a question? too.
Yeah, it's a new question, new topic, I guess. So the pilings, can you speak to that? Because you know, for myself and a lot of people that I meet and talk to, they're, you know, visually you know, make the space and the river look uninviting and dangerous to us. And I've been told that they are contaminated with creosote, and I just don't see the pilings as part of this analysis, which I guess makes sense, but because they're, you know, if you are dredging, I don't know, like, I'm sure you're testing near them because this is where they are. Just trying to understand better. And yeah, what, like Willie said, they're also degrading and causing, you know, presumably further contamination.
Right, and so in areas where they are co-located with sediments that need to be remediated, when we're dredging out those contaminated sediments, we will be removing pilings. There are a lot of pilings in the river, and so in places where those pilings exist with sediment that is not above our action levels, the Superfund project will not be addressing those pilings. And so in our project area, that, you know, the piles that are here, I anticipate being addressed. I'm not sure quite how far the pilings go this way and whether they're all going to be within the footprint or not. There's also a bunch of pilings over here, right? So it looks like those will also be addressed. And then the good news is for the pilings that are outside of our active cleanup, it also kind of clears them. Like, hey, you can go in, other efforts could go in and remove them without triggering a big Superfund problem. So it kind of, like right now, I feel like there's kind of a hold on a lot of potential pile removal projects because we haven't been willing to commit to where the contamination is or isn't. But this new data helps us understand where we can do pile removals and not worry about spreading contamination.
Is that Willie? I see your hand. One second, because Mira does that.
I'm interested to hear what Willie has
Sure.
to say.
Go, Willie. Go for it.
Okay, I was just gonna chime in. Is my video on?
Mhm.
Okay, I just for Casimira's sake and anybody else on the call who hates pilings that do degrade shallow water habitat for fish also, is I have had experience pulling a permit with DEQ to remove pilings at one point. So that's something we absolutely can do outside the Superfund site. We just need to work it out with the property owner, who is, I believe, Parks and Rec. But you know, that's they're not going to want to do it until they have absolute assurance at this point that there's no risk from an environmental perspective. I'm just guessing for Parks, because if I was the property owner, I would want the same thing myself. So just, you know, as the testing moves closer, this data will be helpful in facilitating some of these things to happen, whether or not it happens in the Superfund process or just through our own initiative in the community.
Thanks, Willie.
Thank you, Willie.
All right, I think we better move on to our the education event, because I really want to make sure we all have a chance to talk about that. Everyone's, you know, welcome to reach back out to me with more questions on this. We'll publish, when we do have a link to the final report, we'll publish that out and communicate that with you all as well.
Thanks. Are there any last questions though? Because those are great questions, and so really important. There hasn't been, we haven't had dedicated space to talk about this for a while. So are there other questions? We have a few minutes. Thanks, Laura.
One quick question, I guess. So Josie, if folks want to access the report that comes up in the next month or so, how can they do that?
It'll be published with an EPA through the EPA records management system. So it'll have like one of those really short, nice links. So they could get to it through the story map. If they want to brave the EPA website, they can get to it through that also, but I recommend the story map as an easier one-stop shop for that.
We'll go ahead and drop a link to that in the chat as well. And then I see a question from Laura Feldman in the chat about the status of the sampling video. So I think Laura, is that the day in the life of the sediment core?
Yeah, and I also see Casimira has a question. So we'll get to both of those before we move on. So that great question, Laura. I know that Kathy, who's on too, thank you, and Willie and others had been working on the video. So we had in this working group, for those of you who are new, we'll make them available too. We had been meeting to talk about some video footage that was taken during the 2021 sampling that Josie just went over the results of. And it was some good sampling. We also, because or some good videos, obviously it was good sampling, but it was some good videos of the sampling from you could see the coring, and then we also went to the lab and saw some of the cores being processed. So the status is that we haven't made, I'll just be honest, a lot of progress on that video, unfortunately, since her last discussion, because of the idea which that work group had, which was so great, and you all dedicated your time on your own for that, was to have it be like a life of a Portland Harbor sediment core, and just have a short kind of video, or a short video, but then also maybe video clips in addition to one long video of the different sections. And so now that we're kind of, we've restarted this work group, and Josie's going to talk about upcoming stuff, right, Josie? Because that was another part. There's going to be upcoming sampling that Josie was talking about, the supplemental piece. We want to focus on that again, because at the time, if we do an educational event, it would be good. We talked about it before to have that video ready. So honest answer, not much has happened with the video since the last time we met, which is unfortunate, and I apologize. But we want to re-up it again, because there's going to be a good opportunity for us to use it. So in this working group, we can have it again. So thanks, Laura. Casimira, did you have another question? I know you're off video, but I saw you raised your hand before.
I put it in the chat.
Nope. Gotcha. Nice.
Okay.
Thank you. Josie, can you make hydrographic sonic images of the Cathedral Park and water area publicly available?
To the extent that we collect them, we'll be able to. We will be doing a survey of the subsurface as part of the work in 2023. We have not done that survey work yet.
In that survey, would that include the surveyed locations of the pilings?
It'll include, no. Well, I mean, when you look at it'll include where they're located. We're not going to put a GPS point on each individual piling.
I'm asking because there was a comment earlier that we could remove the pilings to the extent that they don't spread contamination. I think that was a comment made. So
yeah.
If we need to know if they're near to contaminated.
Oh yeah,
material.
Yeah, that's a good. We'll put a note in. I'll talk with our team about that, and hopefully that can be one of the outcomes of our kind of conceptual site model, or understanding of what the features of the site are. Yeah, that'd be a good idea. Thank you.
Great questions. Okay, now it is definitely time to move on to our last round. If you have other thoughts, Josie will stick around after 11:30. So keep on mulling over all that stuff we just presented. So Josie, next steps in that educational activity as a result.
Well, yeah. Okay. So the timeline, where are we at? So this on the left-hand side, the fall of 2021, we did the sampling. We got some initial data back in March of 2022. Then that drove another round of analytical work based on the samples we already had. And we received a draft evaluation report of all that data in November. Then we've been reviewing and finalizing that report for a published date sometime in March. So that gets us to March of 2023. Really, as soon as we saw the sample results in last November, we started planning for the next sampling effort. And so that's going to be a more robust effort. The original work we did in 2021 was really just looking at chemical concentrations in sediment and riverbanks. The work that we do in 2023, it's going to include additional sediment and riverbank samples in those locations where we need to step out and better delineate the contamination, also go deeper down in some places. And it's also going to include the surveys and the habitat assessment and the pore water concentrations. And it's just a much more robust data set that will help us get to that 30% design Cassie was talking about. We anticipate going out in the field starting as early as June of 2023, and we think that work will take us through November, maybe even December, depending on timing and subcontractor availability and that kind of stuff. And this is also the window then that we're hoping to scope out some kind of an in-person educational event.
So I think Alyssa and Josie have done some thinking, some more thinking. We talked about educational events in the past and have a lot of good information from this working group, and all of you. And those of you who are new can weigh in now too. So I'm going to pass it off to Alyssa to talk about next steps and some brainstorming with Josie on the education piece. And I'll keep on looking at the chat in your hands if you have stuff that comes up for you as we talk about this. And Alyssa's going to stop recording.